Mermaids. When I was 12, I learned about mermaids from my 16-year-old cousin Danny, who was staying at our beach house on the coast of Delaware with his mother, my Aunt Nora, the summer my parents' marriage fell apart. He waved a Playboy magazine in my face and showed me pictures of beautiful women in silver gossamer tops. Mermaids, he assured me, mermaids, and grinned knowingly at the photographs of two women resting on a large rock, combing each other's long flowing hair. Too bad you'll never look like them, he snickered, and flipped through the pages. So, Emily, how does it feel to be a skinny girl, flat-chested, like a guy? Let me see, I said, and I grabbed the magazine and then stared in awe at a picture of photographs, beautiful women embraced under the title of Mermaids of the Atlantic. They seemed to drift in shallow water along the tide line. Scales on their rainbow-colored tails shimmered as they curled against each other amid rocks, sand, and pink shells. Their faces were in shadows, but their graceful necks were like those of swans I'd seen in a park near my house in Baltimore. Don't tell anybody I showed you this, he said as he gave me a menacing look. I shrugged and feigned no interest. I hated the way Danny treated me. Those women aren't real, Danny. It's all fake. It's fake makeup and feathers. Who cares? They're sexy. He seized the magazine, folded it, tucked it into his back pocket, and retreated to his room. That summer, I became a proficient swimmer, astonished by the growing strength of my scrawny arms and legs as they propelled me through the cold, uneven waves off the shore. Although my mother had forbidden me to swim alone in the ocean, I swam daily, not in the nearby pool as she assumed, but in the surf about a mile down the shore from our house. My mother was too preoccupied to notice how I spent my afternoons. I plunged into the cool surf and swam against heavy waves and practiced slipping into the sea from sunny rocks. Afterwards, I lay on warm concrete bulkheads and imagined myself with a sleek, glistening tail. The pictures from the magazine lingered in my thoughts as I wandered the beach at sunrise and sunset. And my dreams took on a new vitality that later I realized was the nucleus of desire. In late afternoons, I walked along the shore and measured my distance from home by the flagpole in front of our beach house. The house rippled in lines of heat from the sun, and from a great way off, the house seemed to float castle-like above the sand. My father had inherited the beachfront property earlier from his uncle. At one time, the two-story pink house had hunched over sand dunes 3 streets from the tide line. Several decades of fall hurricanes had sucked 2 rows of oceanfront houses into the sea, leaving the bulk of my father's legacy listing on stilted legs like a roseate ibis leaning into the wind. The closer one drew to it, the more the house seemed to stumble and catch itself at the ocean's edge. Waves lapped against the pilings of the ocean side of the house at high tide. The light of the full moon, the screen porch creaking as the whirling waters tugged at the house and whispered seductively, testing the tenacity of the sloping floorboards. Summer evenings, I sat on the floor, stroked the cool wood planks with my hands, tantalized by the hazards of splinters. With no one my age to amuse me, I listened to the mutterings of the house and watched the waves, dully aware of an unease. I supposed it was loneliness. Sometimes my mother played cards with me. The television, broken the summer before, remained dusty and ignored because my mother preferred silence. She was tall, blonde, willowy, and increasingly remote when my father was around. That summer, she developed dark circles of worry around her eyes. I heard her sometimes walking about the unlit house, late at night, banging into furniture, crying out softly. She sat each morning drinking coffee on the screen porch, her hands tightening around the cup as she watched the ocean's daily attacks on the underpinnings of our house. My father, a criminal court judge, stayed in Baltimore during the week and came out only on weekends, a visitor in his own home. He arrived most Friday nights around 8, splendidly pressed in a white shirt and dark suit in spite of the heat, "Muriel, my Scotch," he would say, ordering a triple Chevis on the rocks with a twist, with the wave of his hand as if he were in a familiar restaurant. My mother always rushed to accommodate his request, as though she had not anticipated it. He rarely spoke to me except to inquire whether I was reading the books from the list he had posted on the refrigerator, which included two of his favorites, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. I lied that I was. Perhaps he knew his simple inquiry would lead me to a hasty retreat before he could question me. He liked politics and had begun to talk about running for governor. He did not seem to like being at the beach. He never went swimming, and only once do I remember him walking on the beach with my mother. Even then, he wore his suit and hard black shoes and only removed his tie. Most of the time, he sat in the screen porch smoking, sipping scotch, and reading court briefs. In the evenings, after dinner, he and my mother argued quietly behind the closed door of her bedroom while I worried about our family. Sunday afternoons, the house seemed to exhale with relief when at 3 o'clock he shoved papers into a dark leather valise and left. He backed his Lincoln out of the driveway without so much as a wave, and I imagined him speeding across the toll bridge to the city, pursued by my mother's unhappiness. In July of that summer, my mother invited her sisters to the beach to help buffer my father's visits. Nora and Clarissa were older, less elegant versions of my mother. The sisters had always been close. During the week, they played tennis, sang silly songs, shopped, played cards, and started the cocktail hour around 4 o'clock every afternoon. My mother's spirits improved when her sisters arrived. She talked about painting again. Her eyes grew bright and filled with conviction until the weekend arrived. I eavesdropped on whispered conversations she had with my aunts and learned more about her sadness. "Morgan doesn't care anymore." I heard the break in my mother's voice as she told them. "I think we're headed for divorce, but please don't tell Emily, not yet." And so I knew and wished every day that I did not. My aunts eased the tensions. Both had majored in literature. Clarissa, the older, a literature professor, was reliable and solid, although my father said she drinks vats of gin and stares at the tides too long, and she quotes all that damned poetry. Well, one of Clarissa's favorites was an old Emily Dickinson. "I do not doubt that self I was competent to me, but something awkward in that fit proves that outgrown I see." To which my mother would laugh and reply, "Clarissa, you still make trains run on time in spite of your fondness for gin." You know, as a child, I thought Clarissa might work for a railroad. Nora, 4 years younger than Clarissa, sang off-color songs and quoted long literary passages that weren't particularly funny to me, but thankfully, they made my mother laugh. Nora worked with a theater group. Often at dinner, she recited bawdy passages from Shakespeare in her best theatrical voice, while Danny studied water spots on his silverware. Nora told my mother that I was an aftershock of salaciousness on a summer afternoon. Later, after I had found the word salacious in the dictionary, I felt vaguely embarrassed. I couldn't imagine my father salacious for even a moment in his life. My aunt's husbands had escaped their marriages in different ways. Clarissa's husband, Rob, was a workaholic lawyer, and though they remained married in name and finances, they rarely saw each other. Nora divorced Uncle Cal 5 years earlier after she caught him with Danny's babysitter. Danny was Nora's only attempt at motherhood. She acknowledged his presence reluctantly. Danny bullied me. He made jokes about us all behind our backs. He was not inclined to get a summer job. And since he had nothing else to do and nowhere to go, he hung out on the beach and at the fishing docks with his buddies, and they spent their days leering at girls who walked along the beach. In the evenings, they bathed themselves in cologne and swaggered off to play miniature golf. The week after Danny showed me the pictures, I slipped into his room and found his collection of Playboy magazines under his mattress. The ones with the mermaid pictures were on top of the stack. I hid the magazine in my room, and after lunch, I opened it and stared at mermaids of the Atlantic. Much to my surprise, the magazine had pictures of naked women lying about in various positions. Feeling strangely lightheaded, I traced the various exposed breasts and hips with my fingers, took off my warm, wet bathing suit, stared at my body in the mirror. My breasts were small. I did not look like the women in the magazine at all. I studied the pictures, reading captions under the photographs as words like erotic and Sappho washed over me. My pulse raced with the rapid, solid strokes of an ardent swimmer. I slipped back into my bathing suit, pulled a shirt over it, and tiptoed into the hall and located Nora's Dictionary of Myths and Legends and next to the Scrabble board on the bookcase behind the stairs. I slipped it under my shirt and walked softly back to my room. I could not find some of the words at first, but I found mermaids and read, according to legend, a mermaid never comes to a false heart. I looked back at the magazine photographs, and the pictures left me trembling and weak. When I heard my mother's footsteps in the hallway, I closed the dictionary and slipped the magazine under a towel just as my mother opened the door. "Emily, honey, you're awfully quiet in here," she said. "Oh, you're reading. I thought perhaps you were taking a nap." She studied my sweating face and glanced at the dictionary. "What an odd thing to read," she said, as she swirled a martini in a frosty glass. She looked as if she'd been crying. "Will you ride your bike down to the fishing pier and get some shrimp for dinner tonight?" She stood in the doorway. "Your father hates shrimp, but he's not coming again this weekend." She stared at me closely, appraising my loyalty. "He's working on a major case." Later, after I bought the shrimp at the store, I pushed my bike along the sandy road home. Thick, salty storm clouds spun their way across the bay and rumbled inland. The pain in my mother's eyes when she mentioned my father made my throat hurt. I got on the bike and pedaled violently just as huge raindrops spattered the sand into pock-marked grids, splashing over the double plastic bags of shrimp. I didn't want to go home. I wanted to ride in the rain forever. I dropped the bike beside the back door and took the drippy bags into the kitchen. Nora stood at the sink mixing a large pitcher of martinis. Brine from the leaking bags of icy shrimp formed a puddle at my feet, but she was pleasantly oblivious as she waved me toward the sink. "Glad you're back. I was just about to send Danny out to look for you." Danny sat sullenly at the kitchen table, removing pickles from a tuna sandwich. "You've been in my room, you little runt," he said, and he glared at me fiercely. He turned to Nora. "Tell her to stay out of my stuff." "Oh, Danny, your room is such a mess, I can't imagine anyone going in there for any reason," Nora said. Danny's ears turned red, and he stuffed the sandwich in his mouth and shrugged. I avoided looking at him, wiped off with a kitchen towel, and hurried upstairs. Danny had ransacked my room, but he had not found the magazine I'd hidden carefully in the back of the closet. I locked the closet door, tied the key around my neck with a string, and retreated to the porch to watch the rain that had settled in for the evening. And the smell of shrimp, steaming, and beer in the kitchen filled the kitchen, and I felt almost unbearably sad. After dinner, Danny left to hang out with his friends while my aunts and mother argued over their card game well into the night. I fell asleep with the Mermaid magazine and dreamed of the women I'd seen in the photographs. The next afternoon, I paddled our dinghy out behind the waves and studied the rocky coastline with binoculars. Elation washed over me. Mermaids! They were sunning themselves, just as I had hoped, on a rocky outcropping near a wild section of the beach. Rowing and swimming into the area seemed impossible with riptides surging. The surf was unsafe for even an experienced swimmer. After dragging the dinghy ashore in a cove, mermaids, I thought, until I moved closer and saw they had, feet, legs, hips. 3 women lay spread out on blankets on smooth rocks below. At first I wondered if my mother and aunts had discovered the cove. But all these women, as I looked more carefully, had dark hair, and they were completely naked. Their bodies were wonderfully tan, like the women I had seen in the magazine. Their bathing suits were stretched out beside them on the sand. I sat down in the shadows, a trembling voyeur, as the waves plunged over the rocks and sent up walls of spray. Their voices, carried by the breeze, tinkle like wind chimes. As the sun dipped low in the sky, the women gathered their things. The smell of coconut suntan lotion mixed with strawberry fragrance drifted through the air. I slipped away and walked a mile back to the dinghy on unsteady legs. I returned the next afternoon and the next. On the third afternoon, 3 bathing suits lay on the rocks, but only 2 women sat on beach towels, staring out at the waves. The third was nowhere to be seen. All at once, someone reached around the outcropping of rock where I crouched and grabbed me. "I've got him," the woman said as she spun me around to face her. "Spying on us, you little jerk." Her fingers dug into my shoulder, and I burst into tears. The woman dropped her hands to her side and stared. "It's a girl." The other 2 women leapt over the rocks and ran to us. The 3 women surrounded me. "Watching us, are you?" said my captor. "You know, that's really rude." "Oh, she's just a baby," said one of the women. "Cute. Why, I bet she's not even 12. "Oh, she's too young," said the one who had captured me. She leaned forward, looked at my face carefully. "Maybe give her 10 years. What's your name, kid?" I was embarrassed, and yet thrilled to find myself so close to these women. I felt like a specimen pressed under glass. "Emily," I said, smoothing the rocky sand with my bare feet to avoid looking directly at their bodies. "Have you told anybody about us, Emily?" "No," I said, relieved that I had not yielded to an earlier urge to impress Danny with my discovery. "Look at her," said the tall woman, lifting her sunglasses. "She doesn't have a clue. Do you, sweetie?" She patted me on the head. "Emily, do us a favor and don't mention this to anyone, okay?" I nodded. Off in the distance, storm clouds rumbled along the horizon. "I have to get home," I said. "They'll be looking for me." I lied. Inhabited by the women's sensuality and kindness, I willed my wobbly legs into motion. I looked over my shoulder twice as I climbed the rocks out of the cove, and they were putting on their swimsuits. Later, I would regret that I had not waved. Twice that week I returned, and no one was there. I woke at night breathing hard as though I had swum from a great distance. During the day, I walked the beach, numbly aware of the growing tension in the house. My mother spent even more time alone each day. Her sisters hovered about, worry lining their faces, and they took trays of food to her bedroom when she missed dinner. Looking back now, I barely trust my memory of the next few weeks. So much happened. My father did not come to the beach house that weekend or the next. Then he phoned late one Friday afternoon, and I watched Nora raise her eyebrows when he requested that she give his excuse to my mother. Danny, who admired my father more than I did, pulled me aside. "Oh, he's got somebody on the side, you know," he said. "All men do." He seemed pleased by this, and I felt the thick anger of betrayal building in the back of my throat. At dinner, my mother sat grimly resolved. My aunts cleared the dishes and left us alone. "Emily," she said finally, "I need to talk to you." And so late into the evening, we sat in the dark, listening to the soft slap of high tide against the porch stairs. "Your father and I are not happy together," she began, and as she told me what I already knew, the house seemed to roll ever so slightly, like a ship anchored in a shallow bay. I was rendered older in those moments. By the end of it, I felt dizzy and vaguely ill. My mother looked relieved by the telling, as though a great weight had shifted between us. I imagined the house an island, and yet I felt safe knowing my mother could leave my father but not me. Later the next day, on my way home from the movie, I was surprised to see my father's picture on the front page of late editions of the Baltimore Sun, on the racks right outside the theater. The newspaper carried the shocking headline of my father's arrest in Baltimore for soliciting a prostitute. The paper had used an old photograph dressed of him in what Nora liked to call his Clark Gable look. It was my mother's favorite picture of my father from his Princeton yearbook. And though I was not sure what the headline really meant, I realized even then that such a thing brought a shameful end to a judiciary career. I raced home on my bicycle and found Nora on the phone talking to a reporter. Her angry voice echoed throughout the house. "No, you may not speak with her," she said. "Stop calling." She hung up the phone and muttered, "The damn vultures are circling." Clarissa sat blowing her nose into a tissue. "What a disgrace," she said. She shook her head when I asked her what soliciting meant. "Where'd you hear that word?" she asked, but she didn't wait for me to answer. She told me that my mother was in her bedroom. "And please don't bother her right now," she said. I went upstairs to my room and heard my mother crying in the bedroom next to it. My aunts moved about the house, murmuring with sturdy drinks in hand. "Nothing shocks me anymore," Nora said. "Well, I thought he was involved with somebody, but this is just sad," Clarissa agreed. I longed to escape the creaking sorrow of that house. As I left to walk along the shore, I found Danny sitting outside on the back stairs. He glanced up at me when I passed. "I guess you know what a prostitute is," he said. "But you'd think he could do better than that. You'd think he would at least have had a mistress." He stopped cleaning his nails with a penknife and stood up. "If anybody ever cares to ask, I'm out." He headed toward the boardwalk. Walking along the shore, I watched the steady ripples of the incoming tide as a sandpiper scurried along the surf's edge. I sat down in the sand and thought about my parents. I didn't know my parents at all. I didn't know my father at all and my mother only a little. But in that moment, comfort came to me in thinking about the mystery and the kindness of the women I had seen in the cove. But I felt foolish for even thinking they were mermaids. Over the years, I've heard a number of versions of that summer. Sometimes I watch the same account in my mind's eye, as if it were a movie about unhappy people. My father came to talk with my mother. Wait a minute. My father came to talk with my mother the following evening, and as he left her room after only a few minutes, I have been told he asked to speak to me, but my aunt sent him away. I saw him from the stairwell as he passed through the house, and he didn't look like Clark Cable at all. He looked tired and sorrowful. He spoke softly to my aunts as he let himself out. We did not return to our house in Baltimore. So much happened so fast. My aunts packed our things. We moved to a small town in Florida where my mother began teaching art. I entered a new school and discovered a name for the mermaids. The house was sold in the spring, and it washed into the Atlantic the next hurricane season. I don't remember if I ever saw my father again that year, although surely I did. But I do remember how he smelled of Scotch the few times I did see him. He died in a car accident 2 years later. But I clearly remember that on that last bright evening I ever spent at my father's beach house, I walked down to the water's edge, and as the ocean roiled at high tide, the moonlight on the water gave an illusion of the mystery of scales and skin and flowing hair and all that moves just below the surface.